The order on the shelf. Let the body get comfortable first. Start by letting the weight of you settle down into whatever is holding you up. A mattress underneath, a pillow under your head. Nothing needs holding up by you. All of that is being taken care of already. It has been since the moment you lay down. Let the attention go down to the feet. And just notice them, the toes, the arches, the heels resting against the sheet. Let them be heavy. Let them be exactly as warm or as cool as they are. Move up through the ankles, into the shins and the calves. There is often a low, unnoticed tension held in the calves, a readiness left over from standing, and it can be put down now. Nothing is going to require standing. Notice the knees, and then the long muscles of the thighs, among the strongest in the body and with no work to do at this hour. Let them go soft and wide. Let the hips settle. Let the lower back settle. Let the pelvis be heavy, and let the spine lengthen a little on its own, without being made to. Up through the belly now, letting it loosen. Nothing needs to be held in. Your ribs are moving a little by themselves, opening and closing without instruction. Let the breath be whatever size it wants to be. There is no correct depth. Let the chest soften and the space between the shoulder blades and the shoulders themselves, drawn all day slightly upward and forward. Let them slide back and down, away from the ears. Down the upper arms. Past the elbows, along the forearms into the wrists. Let the hands be open or curled, whichever is easier. The fingers can be entirely still now. Back up to the throat, which can soften. Then the jaw, holding as usual more than it needs to. Let the teeth come apart slightly, and the tongue rest low in the mouth. Soften the lips and the cheeks and the small muscles around the eyes, where the day's looking gathers. Let all of that release. Let the forehead smooth. Let the scalp loosen and the whole head grow heavy against the pillow. And now just the whole body at once, heavy and warm and unhurried, breathing on its own. From here, the only job is to listen, and to stop listening whenever listening stops being easy. Nothing that follows needs to be remembered. There is a low mound in northwestern Syria, about 35 miles south of Aleppo, called Tel-Mardik. Tel is simply the Arabic word for such a mound, and there are hundreds of them across that plain, each one the compacted rubble of a settlement that people built and rebuilt on the same spot for centuries until they stopped. They are too regular to be natural and too worn to look built. In 1964, a young Italian archaeologist named Paolo Mattei began digging into that hill. He had been drawn there partly by an object already sitting in the museum at Aleppo, a stone basin carved with figures, which had come from Tel-Mardik, and looked to him like it belonged to a serious place rather than a village. He did not know what the hill had been called. Nobody did. There was a name known from Mesopotamian records, from the cities of the river plains of what is now southern Iraq. Ebla, a city that Sargon, the king who built the first Akkadian empire, claimed to have conquered, and that his grandson Naram-Sin claimed to have conquered as well. It was clearly an important place, whose location had simply been lost. 4 seasons in 1968, the excavation turned up the broken torso of a basalt statue. Someone had dedicated it to Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war worshipped across Mesopotamia and Syria. Its inscription named the man who had commissioned it, a ruler called Ebla, and it dated itself 8 years after Ishtar had made herself present in the city. It fixed the name Ebla to the hill. Ebla lived in the 20th century before Christ, which is to say a little after the year 2000 BC, and the dates from here on run backwards as they get older. The 3rd millennium BC comes before the 2nd, and the 4th before the 3rd. His city was itself built on the ruins of an older one. About 350 years below him, sealed under that debris, there was a palace. Excavators labeled it Palace G, and found it in stages through the early 1970s. In 1974, one small room gave up 42 lens-shaped clay tablets, thick as a bar of soap and covered in the wedge-shaped marks that give cuneiform its name. Nothing like them had been found in Syria from anything like that period. Writing in this form was a technology of the southern river plains, and the working assumption had been that Syria in the 3rd millennium had no archives of its own. Finding it this far west, and this early meant the assumption was wrong. Then, in the autumn of 1975, the excavators opened a room off the eastern side of the palace's great reception courtyard, and found its floor covered in tablets from wall to wall. Counts vary depending on what is being counted. Complete tablets, large fragments, small fragments, chips too small to read. Something over 15,000 catalogued items came out of that one room, representing perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 original documents. Smaller deposits turned up elsewhere in the palace, including a group of about 22 large tablets that had been left in the reception courtyard lying on wooden planks, a sort of tray for carrying them, and were found still resting on the charred remains of it. This archive survived because the palace burned. Unbaked clay does not last. Left in the ground in a damp climate, it softens and merges back into the soil. Firing is what makes clay durable, and the administration at Ebla did not fire its accounts because there was no reason to. These were working documents, the contents of a filing cabinet, meant to be consulted for a few years and then discarded or reused. They exist now, 4,300 years later, because a fire went through the building and baked them where they sat. The fire did one more thing. Tablets in the great room had been standing upright in partly recessed wooden shelving along the walls, arranged in rows, leaning against each other the way books lean. When the shelving burned, they came down in sequence, in heaps that preserved the order they had been standing in, and they lay in those heaps under the collapsed roof until they were dug out. So the excavators had recovered a filing system, recording exactly where each tablet lay after the collapse let them work backwards to which shelf it had stood on, and roughly where along that shelf. The monthly textile accounts of one administration had occupied the upper shelf along the eastern wall. Those of the next administration continued from there. The annual accounts of metals sat lower, arranged in their own sequence. The room had been organized by subject and by date, by people who knew what an archive is for. That physical order matters, because the documents themselves are, for the most part, undated. The tablets are written in cuneiform, and cuneiform is a script rather than a language, in the way the Latin alphabet is a script. It was invented for Sumerian, the language of the earliest southern cities, then adapted for Akkadian, which belongs to the Semitic family, the one that includes Hebrew and Arabic, and eventually stretched over half a dozen unrelated tongues. Its signs were legible to the excavators from the start. Some of the tablets are in Sumerian, which was already well understood. Many more are in something else. A Semitic language written with a mixture of Sumerian word signs and phonetic spellings, a language nobody had a name for because nobody had known it existed. Giovanni Pettinato, the epigrapher attached to the expedition, the man whose job was reading the inscriptions, gave it one. He called it Paleo-Canaanite, on the grounds that its vocabulary looked strikingly like Hebrew, and that the languages of the eastern Mediterranean coast, Hebrew and its neighbors, seemed the right family to file it under. He withdrew that name fairly quickly, because the vocabulary and the grammar pointed in different directions. Vocabulary is the easy part of a language to borrow and the easy part to change. The grammatical machinery underneath it, the way verbs are built and nouns are inflected, is far more conservative and therefore far better evidence of ancestry. At Ebla, that machinery looks Eastern, which is to say it looks like Akkadian. Paleo-Syrian was proposed in place of Paleo-Canaanite, and that name undersold the Eastern features just as badly. In the end, the field settled on Eblate. Whether Eblate is its own branch of East Semitic or an early dialect of Akkadian has been contested for 4 decades, and is contested still. A part of the difficulty is the writing. Cuneiform, as used at Ebla, is a cumbersome instrument for a Semitic language. A scribe could write a word out syllabically, or write it with a Sumerian word sign, and leave the reader to supply the Eblate word underneath, or do something in between. They usually did something in between. A great many texts are almost entirely word signs, which means the Eblate behind them is invisible. The meaning is written down and the grammar is not. Among the tablets, though, there are lexical lists, columns of Sumerian words with their Eblate equivalents written alongside. These are the oldest bilingual dictionaries known to exist anywhere. Matthey's judgment is that they are not copies of anything imported from the south, but original work, compiled at Ebla by scribes trained to compare languages, doing something nobody had done before. Where such an entry gives the Eblate word for a Sumerian sign, that sign's silent readings elsewhere in the archive become audible. There are also copies of Sumerian words spelled out phonetically, made as reading aids, and those preserve how Sumerian actually sounded at a period that has left almost no other phonetic evidence. A teaching aid written in northern Syria is now a primary source for the sound of a language spoken hundreds of miles to the southeast. For years, though, the public story of Ebla was about the Bible. On the 29th of October, 1976, at a conference of biblical scholars in St. Louis, Pettinato announced that the Ebla tablets contain the names of Sodom and Gomorrah. Over the following years, in lectures and articles, and eventually in the popular archaeology press, further claims accumulated around that one. That the archive contained personal names matching Adam and Eve, and Abraham and Ishmael. That there was a creation hymn with lines resembling Genesis. That there was a purification ritual involving the release of a goat, comparable to the scapegoat of Leviticus. And most consequentially, a claim about names of the kind that carry a God's name inside them, the way Nathaniel or Michael carry one. Pettinato reported that the divine element at the end of such names at Ebla shifted, over time, from the ordinary word for God to something he read as the 2 letters Y and A, and he connected that to the divine name Yah. He was careful in print not to claim that this was the God of Israel. The newspapers dropped the distinction. Alfonso Archi, who took over the epigraphic publication, contested all of it in 1979 and again in 1981. On the creation hymn, his position was that the passages in question are broken to the point of incomprehensibility, and that nothing can be built on them. On the divine name, he argued that the ending was a diminutive suffix in personal names, the ancient equivalent of a pet name, and later that the sign in question should be read as the ordinary word for God after all. None of these arguments could be settled in the ordinary way, because the facsimiles had not been published. A facsimile, in this trade, is a careful hand drawing of the signs on a tablet, the thing that lets a second scholar check a first scholar's reading. What circulated instead was one man's sign-by-sign rendering of the tablets into our own letters. So most of the field was arguing about objects it had not seen, with the originals in Syria. That is one reason disputes at Ebla tend to stay open. Place names produced their own overreading. An attempt in 1983 to match some 80 entries in a geographical list to sites on the eastern Mediterranean coast identified one of them as Beirut. The same list has since been read as a catalogue of Mesopotamian places, and that particular entry as a town in eastern Iraq. Underneath the biblical quarrel, there was an institutional one between Pettinato and Matthei over who controlled the publication, and it ended with Pettinato leaving the project. There was also a political dimension. Since the material was Syrian and Syrian officials objected to an interpretation that turned their site into an appendix to Israelite history. Heat went out of the controversy in the early 80s. What remains of it in the literature is a settled negative. Ebla has essentially nothing to say about Abraham and his descendants, or about Sodom and Gomorrah, or about the origins of Israelite religion. The geographical list is now called the List of Geographic Names. All this while, one of the most finely sequenced bodies of administrative documents surviving from the third millennium sat in the storerooms. Most of the archive is accounting. There are roughly 500 monthly accounts of textiles, garments issued from the palace stores to named individuals, with quantities of silver and gold added for the more important recipients. There is a parallel series of annual accounts of metals, tracking what came in and what went out. There are deliveries from subordinate towns, gifts to and from other kingdoms, rations, personnel, livestock. Ebla ran on wool, with something like 140,000 sheep and goats in its flocks, and a textile industry that turned the wool into the standard currency of Near Eastern diplomacy. Almost none of it is dated. The monthly textile accounts give the month and nothing else. A handful of documents carry a year name, and those year names are the ordinary Mesopotamian kind, built from a memorable event rather than a number. The year the king of Mari died, the year in which a man called Nizi died, the year Mari was defeated. Everything else about the sequence is reconstruction, and it rests on two things. One is the shelf order. The other is a long piece of work by the epigrapher Archi and his colleague Maria Giovanna Biga, published in 2003, which took the annual metal accounts and cross-referenced them against everything else in the archive until the years fell into a line. That line shows a state with a king and a chief minister, in which the minister held most of the practical power. He commanded the army. He ran the administration, the trade, the provincial governors. That office was prominent enough that, when the tablets were first being read, the men who held it were taken for kings. It took until the mid-80s for the mistake to be corrected. 3 ministers appear in the archive. Arukum held office for about 5 years. Then Ibrahim held it for 18, in almost every one of which there was a war. Then Ibrahim's son, Ibi-Zikr, held it for 17, and his inheriting of his father's post is the moment a second dynasty forms alongside the royal one. Set against the reigns of the kings they served, their 3 terms come to the last 5 years of one king and the 35 years of his successor, which is about 40 years in all. 40 years of a functioning state, month by month in sequence. Most of what is known about the 3rd millennium is known in centuries. Through those decades, and for a long time before them, the defining relationship in Ebla's world was with Mary. Mary sat on the middle Euphrates, about 250 miles to the east, controlling the river route between Syria and the Mesopotamian south. It was the tollgate, and anything moving between the 2 worlds moved past it. Early in the sequence, Ebla is paying. A king of Mary, Iblalil, campaigned through Eblate territory along the river, and across the reigns of him and his successors, the accounts record more than 1,000 kilograms of silver going east and 63 of gold. One tablet is a text in which a ruler of Mary called Anadagan sets out, for an Eblate reader, a catalogue of the cities his predecessors had taken. Petinato originally took Anadagan for an Eblate general reporting home. It was later shown that he was writing from the other side. Scholars have disagreed at length over whether the text is best understood as a letter, a report, or a bill. The silver is recorded in any case. The tide turned under a king called Urkabdamu, who launched a counteroffensive and also concluded a treaty with a neighboring kingdom called Abarsal. That treaty survives on a single tablet and is among the earliest written treaties known from anywhere. Ebla's own minister, Ibrahim, spent his term fighting, and in the last stretch of the archive, Ibi-Zikr assembled a coalition of allies from the north and east, met Mary in the field near Turka, some 40 miles upriver from Mary itself, and won. The accounts note the distributions that follow a triumph. About 3 years after that, the palace burned. 3 answers to the question of who burned it have held the field ever since. The first is the Akkadians. Sargon's inscriptions, which survive in copies made centuries later by student scribes in the southern city of Nippur, say that the god Dagon gave him the upper land, and they name Mary, a place called Yarmuti, and Ebla itself, spelled a little differently by his scribes. Matthew has favored Sargon, and the attribution has the appeal of matching the archaeology to a name in a text. The difficulty is that Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin made a nearly identical claim 2 generations later, saying that a god opened the way for him and gave him the kingdom of Armanum and Ebla. Both cannot be truthful claims about the same fire. The second answer removes the Akkadians entirely. The 2 scholars who reconstructed the archive's final years argued that the destroyer was Mary, taking its revenge for Turka. The candidate on that reading is a king known from his own seals as Ishqi-Mari, apparently the last ruler of Mari before Sargon took it. The third answer is that nobody did it. Michael Astor pointed out that the destruction is largely confined to the palace, that there was no convincing evidence of looting, and that an accidental fire in a building full of oil and wood and textiles is not an exotic hypothesis. It has never had many supporters among the people who have handled the material. Then, in 2020, a new document was published. Iraqi archaeologists digging at a site in Wasit Province in eastern Iraq had recovered a fragmentary inscription of Naram-Sin, not a later copy made in a schoolroom, but a contemporary one from his own reign, and so the best evidence anyone has about that campaign. It describes a long war against a substantial Western kingdom and its allies, with a claim of 80,508 captives taken from it, a number oddly exact for an inscription of that kind. The kingdom at the center of that war is Armanum, in the hills to the north. Ebla is present, but as a secondary participant, a shadow of the city the archive describes, which is an argument, though not a decisive one, that the palace had already burned well before Naram-Sin arrived. Suppose the question of who burned it were settled tomorrow. That would still not fix the date, because Sargon and Naram-Sin and Ishqi-Mari are themselves not fixed to absolute time. Chronology for this period rests on how many years each king is said to have reigned in ancient lists of uneven reliability. And beyond that, on astronomical back calculation from a set of observations of Venus recorded more than 500 years later, which can be matched to several different starting points. The system most generally used puts Sargon's reign at about 2334 to 2279 BC. Two rival systems make everything 64 or 96 years more recent than that, and choosing among them is an active argument in its own right, with nothing to do with Ebla. For the fire itself, 16 samples were radiocarbon dated, all of them from things that had been alive only a year or two before it, seeds and twigs rather than old timber. They place the destruction somewhere between about 2367 and 2293 BC. 74 years of uncertainty, a span wider than the whole archive that fire preserved. So the internal chronology is close to perfect, and the external chronology is not. And the internal chronology did not come from the clerks. The clerks wrote the month at the top and left the year to look after itself, because these were papers for use within the working life of the men who filed them, and everybody in the building knew what year it was. It came from the shelves, and from the work of two scholars putting the metal accounts side by side. So a filing habit supports a finer chronology than the royal inscriptions do, and the royal inscriptions are the documents that actually say whose year it was. Excavation at Tel Marduk ran, more or less continuously, from 1964 until 2010. Then it stopped for more than a decade, because the Syrian war began the next year, and in it, several 100,000 people were killed and much of the country's population was driven from home. Publication kept going. There are 19 volumes now in the main text series, alongside an earlier one, and since 2007, a digital corpus that lets the documents be searched by personal name and place name and month across the whole archive, turning 40 years of accounting into something a scholar can query from anywhere. Satellite imagery records what happened to the mound. From the spring of 2012, looting pits appear across its high central part, dug by people in a country where ordinary work had stopped. Trenches were cut into the slopes to shelter armored vehicles. Banks of earth were pushed up around its edge. A training ground was laid out on the western side. Heavy machinery worked beside the palace of the later city that stood above Palace G. One excavated area is no longer visible in the imagery at all, and between early 2017 and the spring of 2018, the exposed remains of a temple and of the burned palace stopped showing up in it. The site museum was hit in an airstrike. So the layering that recorded the first destruction, the stratigraphy, the sequence of deposits that lets an excavator read a mound the way the fallen tablets let them read a shelf, has been cut through in many places. An Italian team came back to look at the damage in 2022 and returned to dig in September of 2024 under a new director, David Nadali. That season brought up a basalt royal statue missing its head. An agreement with the Syrian Antiquities Directorate for further work was signed the following June. A new sequence of documents is accumulating. Field notebooks, fine spots, photographs, a record of where each thing lay in relation to everything around it. This time the position is being written down on purpose by people who know that position is the evidence.